What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today's reaction video is what if the world without the US part 2. We did part 1 2 days ago.
Yeah,
2 days ago. You guys enjoyed it. Don't worry for people who were thinking this part 2 was a civil war. That will be coming in 24 hours time.
Yeah.
Tomorrow. We just thought we'll mix it up a little bit, do part 2 of this because you guys enjoyed this as well. When we left it off, it was obviously talking about World War II mainly. It was focusing on stuff like that, all the stuff going to the US and stuff like that, and how kind of the US helped build the European Union pretty much, wasn't it?
Yeah.
With providing funds and stuff like that to kind of for Europe to regrow. If you haven't checked out part 1, the link will be at the top of the description. I'm not sure where part 2 is gonna go. We've already realised that in history we could be living in a complete different scenario.
Yeah, definitely.
Without the US, but you could say that same for other countries, couldn't you?
Yeah, I feel like some of the bigger countries you could say the same thing.
Maybe not on the same scale.
No, definitely not.
But you could say on other parts without certain countries it'd be different. But I think the US played such a major role, which we didn't really know about as well.
Yeah, like without France you wouldn't have croissants.
Well, there you go. Without France we wouldn't have croissants. We could have croissants, so it could be named something else.
No, it wouldn't be.
You don't think so?
No.
Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Without France, would you have
China,
croissants?
we wouldn't have Chinese food.
That is true.
In fact, we wouldn't have a lot of stuff without China.
True, we wouldn't have a lot of stuff as well. But yeah, no, it's interesting to see how these countries have influenced the world. And the one without the US, it's been interesting. And let's carry on. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Smash that like button, guys. Smash the subscribe button. And let's check out what would the world be without the US. Part 2, what we got.
In our first episode, In a World Without the US, we looked at the ways that World War II and the post-war era might have turned out if the US had simply refused to engage the world and remained isolationist. We discovered that there would be a near certainty of a World War II that ended with a stalemate heavily favoring Germany and positioning it for unrivaled superpowerdom in Europe. We also saw how US non-interference in Korea would have led to a unified and communist Korea with strong ties to the USSR and China, prompting a resurrection of the Japanese imperial state. Today, we're going to see what might have happened if the US exited the world stage at various points in history after the post-World War II era. Iranian democracy. Without the US's interference in Iran, the revolution that brought down the monarchy and ushered in a fundamentalist government may not have played out the way it did in our world. In fact, a revolution which would end up with a religious fundamentalist government may have never been necessary in the first place, were it not for US and British interference in 1953 that saw a democratically elected prime minister ousted by a military coup d'etat organized by MI6 and the CIA. Britain, who owned a majority share of the Anglo-Persian oil company, today BP Oil, saw their continued ownership of the Iranian company as vital to their national interests, as it helped alleviate their budget shortfalls and also powered their oil-fired navy. However, Iranians began to chafe that the British continued to be the primary beneficiary of the company's revenues, and in 1953, newly elected Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry. This did not sit well with the British at all, and they immediately besieged the US for help in overthrowing Mossadegh. Initially, the US was opposed to the idea and saw the British as meddlesome and destructive to the nation of Iran. But when...
And you know why that was? I mean, I don't know too much about it, but I'm guessing it's all money, isn't it?
Yeah.
All money, especially with the oil when the oil's involved. But it's meant to know what things happen. I don't know too much about this, so I don't want to comment what was right and wrong, but money's always involved.
Yeah.
Britain claimed that Mossadegh may in fact draw close to the Soviet Union, an unlikely event. The British played to President Dwight D. Eisenhower's worst fear, communist expansion around the world. Thus, he approved the overthrow of Mossadegh, and the CIA and MI6 immediately went to work, manipulating the Iranian public into supporting the Shah's removal of Mossadegh from his democratically elected position. Without the US, Britain would have been unable to remove Mossadegh from power, which would have resulted in a crippling blow to the British economy as it lost its controlling share of one of the largest oil companies in the world. Iran's own economy would have flourished, as would have its democratic values, as popular leaders such as Mossadegh cultured a strong, secular, and socially aware Iran that year by year ate away at the political power of the Shah. In many respects, Iran could today resemble Britain, a strong democracy with a nobility that serves as nothing more than figureheads who wield no real political power whatsoever. Seeing its own values reflected reflected in a strong Iranian democracy, the US would have seen Iran as a regional partner rather than the potential foe it's considered today, as a counterbalance to the growing influence of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. With the Persian Gulf being the main tap for the global oil supply, the European democracies would have vied to establish strong ties with Iran. And while the Soviet Union would have sought to strengthen its own ties with Iraq, both sides vying for political influence in the most oil-rich region in the world. The reason why is simple. While contrary to popular opinion, today's governments of the West don't plunder Middle Eastern oil for their own benefit. Rather, a strong influence in the region gives them the strategic capability to shut off the oil tap for potential enemies, such as China or Russia. In essence, one side could shut off the flow of oil to the other side in the case of a war. And that's what makes the Middle East so strategically important to the world. With Western Europe and the Soviet Union vying for influence and power in the Middle East, it would have inevitably led to massive Middle East war. While it would likely not have been of a scale appropriate enough to term World War III, the US's exit from the Middle East would have without a doubt launched a regional conflict to rival any of the largest European wars. During the Iran-Iraq...
Wow, that's interesting. And again, with that whole pipe thing, the only thing I can think of at the moment is kind of like with the gas in Russia.
Yeah.
We won't get into it too much, but it is like so much gas coming from there, and then suddenly, cost war, tensions, cut it off. You hold the power because then everyone else is getting agitated because the money's going up to pay for it because you've got to get it elsewhere. As I say, the Middle East, they are gold mine because that's where all the oil is, and it's just like raking in, and if you don't agree with it, we'll just cut you off. Potentially, you know what I mean? I know it's not that simple, but it's quite mental to think, isn't it?
War of 1980 to 1988, the Soviet Union heavily supported Iraq, and after the war, Iraq was sitting on piles of Soviet hardware and a huge national budget deficit. This would lead to the invasion of oil-rich Kuwait, and in our world, this invasion was stopped by a US-led coalition. In a world where the US decided to simply walk away from the world, though, Iraq would have very quickly turned its attention on regional rival and very oil-rich nation Saudi Arabia. At the time, Saudi Arabia relied heavily on US protection, and the US saw Saudi Arabia as not just a vital economic partner, but a vital strategic partner as well, whose location allowed the US to ensure it could control the global oil tap in case of war against Russia or China. The US thus supplied much of the Saudi military and even helped train it, and when Iraq invaded Kuwait, it was Saudi Arabia who saw the first US troops land, and were immediately dispatched into defensive positions to protect Saudi Arabia's oil wealth, while the Saudis' own military largely remained a supporting and token force. Without the US, however, Saudi Arabia would never have been able to withstand an Iraqi attack, who would have plundered Saudi wealth in order to pay off its massive deficit incurred by the almost decade-long war with Iran. Seizing Saudi oil supplies, Iraq would have become a regional superpower, firmly entrenched with the Soviet Union, and in effect giving the Soviets control over the majority of the world's oil supplies. Western Europe would have immediately financed a war against Iraqi aggression in a bid to avert this strategic catastrophe. But without US firepower and military coordination, the coalition that took out Saddam's forces in the first Gulf War would have been dramatically underpowered. Throughout the campaign, it was US intelligence and recon assets that coordinated coalition attacks, and US stealth aircraft who launched crippling blows against what was at the time one of the world's most formidable air defense networks. Equally important, though, was American pressure on Israel and the efforts of US troops to hunt down Iraqi Scud launchers targeting Israel that prevented that nation from retaliating against Iraq, and thus upsetting the rest of the Islamic states in the coalition, tearing the alliance apart. Soviet military assistance would have flowed directly into Iraq, possibly even extending into actual combat assistance, such as that provided to China during the Korean War against the US. In our world, the presence of overwhelming American firepower at the head of a huge international coalition kept the Russians out of the Gulf War. But in a world without the US, the international coalition against Iraq would have been decidedly weaker, and victory much more achievable for Iraq. The Soviet Union would have thus thrown its full support behind Iraq, with little fear facing retaliation from the comparatively much weaker Western European nations. After an Iraqi victory and the seizing of Saudi Arabia's vast oil wealth, a healthy stream of very lucrative oil contracts would have flowed into the Soviet Union, enriching it economically and perhaps averting its eventual collapse. Cuba-centric South America. Almost from the moment Fidel Castro took power and ousted the US-backed dictator ruling Cuba, the United States tried to remove him from office. Yet in a world without the US,
isn't it? Because you hear about all this history and stuff like that, but you don't actually realise until it starts going in how much a part each country plays in. You know what I mean? You just hear about Iran, Iraq and stuff like that. And the knock-on effects.
I know.
the world could have been so different today.
Could have been.
Like, you know what I mean?
It's kind of scary to think about, actually.
Definitely, and again, some people won't like the world it's in today anyway. Some people will say, oh, it could have been better and stuff like that, but it could have been a lot worse. You know what I mean? Whatever you say, it could have been a lot worse. And it's just mental to think. And again, the US, just such a big influence with the military spend, the amount of people, I guess, just their economic power, that they can basically avoid whole wars and stuff like that, just with a little bit of, we're on their side. Do you know what I mean? It's quite mental to think.
Cuba would have been free to export its revolution abroad, targeting neighboring countries with its communist revolutionary fervor. Here in the real world, though, the US failed to remove Castro from power, yet it was very successful at limiting or outright countering the influence of Cuba's revolutionaries in other nations. For decades, the US and Cuba, backed by the Soviet Union, fought an undeclared war of influence, and sometimes actual weapons, in countries throughout South and Central America. The US, fearful of communist expansion in its backyard, did all it could to eliminate that threat, even going so far as to depose democratic governments, such as it did in Chile when its governments became too friendly with communist Cuba or the Soviet Union. Without the US, however, communist influence would have spread across the southern part of the Western Hemisphere, and today Central and South America would likely be made up of communist states and a small number of very communist-friendly democracies. Many dictators and the brutal atrocities they committed while in power against their political enemies would not have arisen or maintained power. Without US support, Chile's own General Augusto Pinochet would never have succeeded in overthrowing the democratically elected Salvador Allende and gone on to become one of South America's most oppressive dictators. The Soviet Union survives and wins the Cold War. If the United States had decided to pull all its troops home after World War II and taken no interest in global politics, there's no doubt that the Soviet Union would have won the Cold War against the democratic West. Without American firepower in Europe, the Western democracies would have been forced to stand alone against the Soviet juggernaut, which vastly overshadowed European forces in both scope and capability. The titanic political clout of an unchallenged Soviet Union would have easily bent even France and Britain to its will, lest they face the wrath of the largest mechanized force in world history all on their own. For decades, the United States carefully outmaneuvered the Soviet Union on the international front, resulting in a stunning defeat of the Soviet Union after it was completely economically isolated from the rest of the world. The Soviet Union always fielded a greater number of forces, and the United States always relied on superior numbers of nuclear weapons to keep a parity of power between the two states. However, the end result of decades of sly US international maneuvering was a world where the Soviet Union's greatest economic allies were the small third and second world governments it had backed in Vietnam, Korea, and other places, leaving the Soviet behemoth slowly starving as the world preferred trade with the US and its allies over the Soviets. Without America, the Soviet Union would have been the greatest economic power in the world, and profit alone would have encouraged the nations of the world to trade with it. This great economic clout would have made an untouchable superpower and given it enough influence to economically isolate Western democracies in much the same way that the US did to the Soviet Union in our world. Interestingly enough, though, rather than remaining a hardline communist power, the Soviet Union would likely have resembled a more modern-day China than the communist stalwart we know from the Cold War. Much like China, its growing exposure to global trade would have seen it relinquish central control of the economy in exchange for dramatic economic growth. As China today, the Soviet Union of a world without America would have been a political communist power with a free market system. Nukes everywhere! The greatest casualty of a world without the US, however, would have been the cause of international nuclear peace. Today, US allies from Japan to South Korea to even Britain and Germany all live under the protection of the American nuclear umbrella, with the assurance that a nuclear attack against one of the US's protected states would result in an American nuclear response. While Britain and France still choose to remain nuclear independent, the American nuclear umbrella has ensured that the majority of nations it covers see no need in pursuing a nuclear weapons program, resting secure in the knowledge that no matter what, the US will abide by its promise to protect its allies. A purposeful strategy, the US has for decades shouldered the burden of protecting other nations, knowing that by doing so, it could limit the threat of nuclear proliferation. Less nuclear-capable states in the world means that the world at large remains safer from the threat of nuclear war. Yet,
True, and I guess that if you're protected by nukes, and you have a country sending nukes, you know nukes going to come back, so it's kind of just suicide anyway. So you guys are absolute legends. Land of the free as well. A lot of this all just comes back to commoners and stuff like that, doesn't it? But if it wasn't for you guys, and then obviously the rest of Europe having them principles, but you guys enforcing, having the power to enforce it, then communism would have just gone flying throughout, and then it'd have been kind of like, we'd have lived in basically a regime which is kind of like under like Russia, like North Korea, which is something you don't want to do. And it just shows, again how lucky we are just because the fight, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The power, it's hard to explain, but you get what I mean,
I
don't
get
you?
what you mean.
You guys probably get what I mean. You probably could sum it up better in the comments as well.
Without the US, many nations around the world would desperately seek out nuclear weapons of their own. Britain and France, who already have a small nuclear arsenal, would dramatically increase the number of nuclear weapons they each hold, especially in light of how powerful the Soviet Union would have become without the US to counterbalance its military and political influence. The Soviets themselves proved to be less concerned with nuclear proliferation than the US, and would have likely done little to prevent regimes in places such as Syria and Libya from developing their own nuclear weapons. Even today in our real world, despite assurances of protection from the US, nations such as Jordan and Saudi Arabia both desperately want their own nuclear programs, and Turkey has long sought for NATO nuclear weapons to be under its own control, something the US flat out denied. With the threat of a rising China and a nuclear North Korea, Japan remains confident that it can rely on its American allies. Yet without the US, Japan would have been forced to develop its own nuclear weapons program. In the real world, a Japanese government internal document even went so far as to hypothesize how quickly Japan could develop its own nuclear weapons if it decided it needed to. A world without the US would look vastly different than the one we know today, perhaps better in some areas and vastly worse in others. Like any other nation, the US has its fair share of villainous and heroic deeds alike, though the consequences of its actions are magnified on a greater scale than any other nation due to its power. Still, given the state of the world today, it can be hard to argue against the course the US has plotted throughout the 20th century, despite the many missteps along the way. Today, the US stands as the world's sole superpower after defeating the Soviet Union, and now at last is the time for Americans to demand that the US acts true to its declared values, as it'll likely never have this opportunity in history again. What do you think a world without the US would look like?
I was going to say, if there's a part 3, we check it out. There isn't, which makes sense. I guess we kind of covered all the major world things. But it hitting the nail on the head. I think, like I said at the start, every country out, little things will be different.
Yep.
But it's just for the influence, isn't it?
Yeah, it's got a big impact on so many other places.
Yeah, definitely. And the sole superpower, again, there's pros and cons to everything.
Yeah.
Everybody will have their own opinion in the comments below, because other people like certain things, other people like that as well. But did you enjoy that?
It was a good video.
Smash the like button, guys. Smash that subscribe button and watch the video.
Have a fantastic day.
And we'll see you legends in the next one. Peace.